So I'll be talking about the composite materials with a particular focus on the hydrate plug mitigation potential of them. So a lot of you probably haven't seen me before, so I'll just start talking a little bit about myself before I get into it. So as Bruce mentioned, I'm doing the Master of Professional Engineering here at UWA, specialising in chemical engineering in the penultimate year of my studies. And the research that I'll talk about today was research I completed as a part of my master's degree. And some of my interests in the industry are obviously in flow assurance, LNG processes, and energy storage systems. So I will begin with the conclusions of my work. So the first one, which was quite significant, was that the TPC material showed that it had a significantly lower affinity for hydrates than carbon steel. So this was confirmed in the testing that was performed, where the baseline adhesion for hydrates to this TPC material was recorded as 0.08 millinewtons per meter, which was an 80% reduction for the value recorded for carbon steel. The next one was that hydrate particles did not sinter to the TPC material. So this is specifically talking about hydrate particles that had formed in the bulk fluid sintering to the material. And this was proven for adhesion force being shown to be independent over a contact time tested up to 1 hour. And the last conclusion was that wall growth particles tested in this research showed the highest deposition risk, and I'll talk about those a bit later. But it was shown that those could be well mitigated with the presence of anti-agglomerants, and that in fact less than 0.1 weight % anti-agglomerant in the system was able to completely reduce that adhesion force from 8 millinewtons per meter to roughly 0 or below the detection limits of our apparatus. So I'll just start off by talking a little bit about the actual problem to give it some context. So here I have a figure of the hydrate plug cycle for a multi-phase system. So just to begin, there's got to be some phase dispersion happening. So as Bruce mentioned, water in different types of phases in the system. And basically as that happens, if they're potentially in the hydrate formation region with the low temperatures and high pressures, hydrates can begin to form a nuclei, which begins to happen along here. And the problems begin to start when they begin to adhere to each other. So that cohesion starts to happen, which is shown in this little diagram here. And basically that adhesion mechanism is governed by the capillary bridge, capillary water bridge here that governs their cohesion to each other. And similarly with hydrate particles adhering to the wall, those are also governed by that capillary water bridge that forms between them. So as we move down the system a little bit, those hydrate particles can begin to agglomerate to each other in more and more larger groups basically, and begin to form a problem downstream potentially if they agglomerate large enough together. And then the real problem starts when they begin to properly adhere to the wall and stop there and form those blockages. So the concentration of this research is potentially mitigating that hydrate adhesion to the wall. And I think you'll hear a bit about potentially allowing these hydrates to flow in the fluid stream themselves and be separated at the downstream processing facility. So the two particular components that this research focused on was wall growth particles. So that's hydrate particles that have actually nucleated on the wall, which I mentioned before, and also hydrate particle deposition. So that's more so talking about the traditional, what's been looked at for hydrate particles that nucleate in the fluid and then make their way to the wall and form that deposit based on the capillary bridge adhesion. So the actual material that I've looked at, Bruce then mentioned briefly, is a thermoplastic composite developed by Airborne Oil and Gas. So the one that I'm looking at particularly was PVDF material, which is basically produced by melt fusing layers of this plastic together to really form that structural integrity. So some of the properties that have been tested is a temperature tolerance of 121 degrees Celsius and a pressure tolerance of up to 15,000 PSI. One of the really inherent benefits of this material is that it's inherently corrosion resistant and highly resistant to harmful chemicals. So that was the initial sort of attraction for this plastic material. It's lightweight, spoolable up to long lengths, and has end fittings, which allow for all of those things, basically allow for a reduction in capital expenditure when installing. It's a great insulator. And basically all of these properties have been tested by Airborne Oil and Gas and are well known. And so the focus of this research was to look at the hydrate interactions of the material and potentially a further benefit for it. So just to talk a little bit about the apparatus that this research was performed on, most of it was performed experimentally on the MMF apparatus, which you might have heard a little bit about before, but I'll just briefly talk about in the picture here. So we have a microscope with a recording device, which is basically recording everything that happens in this experimental cell here, which contains the cyclopentane liquid, which is a hydrate former for these experiments. And that is surrounded by a metal cooling jacket, which is just used to cool that experimental cell to the desired temperature for the tests. And basically on either side here, we have a cantilever that's held by a micro manipulator. So the cantilever on the left holds the hydrate particle that's formed, and the cantilever on the right holds the substrate, in this case, the thermoplastic composite substrate. And then a little bit of the research performed at the end was using the Holger simulation to sort of validate a potential technique. So just to talk a little bit quickly about the MMF procedure. So firstly, a hydrate particle was formed with these 4 steps. So firstly, the water droplet was sprayed onto the end of one of the cantilevers, about 300 to 400 micron diameter. And then that particle was transferred to liquid nitrogen, where it was allowed to freeze. And then once that particle had frozen, it was quickly transferred to the cyclopentane bath, which is pre-cooled below the ice point. And then once in the bath, that cyclopentane was raised to above 0 degrees, basically, where it's in that hydrate formation region of up to 7.7 degrees for cyclopentane. So this is just a quick video of one of the pull-off trials. So this is a little bit different to mine in the sense that these are 2 hydrate particles, but it gives the basic idea. So there would have been a predetermined contact time there, and now this is the actual pull-off itself. And so basically that top particle, or in my case, the substrate, is pulled off until the particle dislodges from it. There we go. And so once that happens, the displacement of the hydrate particle from the substrate, in my case, is measured, and that, along with a known spring constant of the carbon fiber, is able to calculate the adhesion force using Hooke's law. So here is just a video of a pull-off for my baseline TPC measurements, just to give you an idea of what that might look like. Here we go. So not a lot of adhesion there. So this is basically where the research started, with finding the baseline for the TPC material, and that was really so we could compare to other materials that have been previously well tested, namely carbon steel. So just to walk you through what this figure is here, on the vertical axis we have the adhesion force, which is in millinewtons per meter, and just each of the trials here labeled. So for each trial there was a new hydrate particle that was nucleated, and basically what each data point there shows is the blue is the mean, with a 95% confidence interval also shown. And along with that is the mean baseline for carbon steel. So basically what you can take out of that figure, which is quite visually obvious, is that the TPC adhesion for each of these trials was well below that for the carbon steel. And in fact, the mean TPC adhesion was an 80% reduction, as mentioned previously. And just for comparison also, Lahane's TPC baseline on a non-water saturated system is plotted here, which agrees closely with my results. And basically that reduction in adhesion force for the TPC in comparison to the carbon steel was explained by a relatively hydrophobic surface. So after this baseline, the next direction of the research was to investigate how this adhesion might vary if the contact time was increased. So for these baseline measurements, there was only a 10-second contact time, which is comparable to other studies that have been done on other materials. And so this is just a short video of the pull-off for a 1-hour contact time. So this had been brought into contact for an hour, and then pull-off was performed. And as you can see, not a lot of difference there at all between that and the previous slide, not a lot of adhesion force. So this figure here shows the adhesion force on the vertical axis, and then the contact time on the horizontal axis. So the 3 contact times that were measured and investigated in this research was 10, 30, and 60 minutes, which previously within that time for other materials, namely carbon steel, there was a relationship that was definitely found. And basically what you can see here is that there is no general trend to this data. And what to take out of that is basically that a sintering mechanism doesn't begin to dominate over these longer contact times, where that was seen with carbon steel, that there was a chemical interaction that would begin to dominate that adhesion and really increase that adhesion force between the particle and the substrate. And that was observed up to 1 hour, basically, yeah. So again, both of these, the baseline and the time-dependent pull-offs, was shown to have a relatively low adhesion force. So the next progression for this was to look at what might potentially happen if the hydrate particles nucleated on the wall as opposed to in the bulk fluid. So here is a figure for from left to right here, showing the 10-minute intervals of a 60-minute annealing period for one of these hydrate particles nucleating on the wall. So basically the procedure for this was just that when the hydrate particle began to nucleate, it was brought into contact with the wall so that that nucleation mechanism could interact with the wall. And what you can sort of see here is between each picture, you can see the interface expanding. You can actually see this film growth here begin to happen. And basically you'll see in the next slide that that film growth really causes the adhesion to increase largely compared to those hydrate particles that were just formed in the bulk fluid. So I'll show you that now. So you can see visually how that was a much larger displacement than the previous two. And you could see a bit of the hydrate film coming off, which was contributing to that adhesion force, which required a much larger pull-off. And so basically here is just plotted the 3 trials that were done, individual trials for that. So for these ones, there weren't repeat pull-offs performed because, as you could imagine, once that hydrate particle had been pulled off, that structure was changed and couldn't be reattached basically by putting it back into contact. So for each of these, you can see that it's generally within the region of 6.5 to 8 millinewtons per meter, which is actually a 100-fold increase from the baseline and roughly the time variant trials. So that obviously poses a much larger risk in the context of plugging. And that, as I mentioned, was basically as a result of that film layer really increasing that adhesion for a chemical interaction. So the next step for this was to introduce anti-agglomerants and potentially look at anti-agglomerants and how they might affect that adhesion force. So just for comparison, we have here the last picture of that 1 hour annealing period. So you can see that film that had formed. And basically here is a video of a 1 hour time lapse for a hydrate particle forming with 0.05 weight% anti-agglomerant in the system. So I'll show you how that played out now. So as you can see, very different. That interface is extremely small. So basically the anti-agglomerants really interfered with that hydrate nucleation mechanism to the wall. And you can actually see it was forced to grow outward like that. And it's quite interesting. You'll see the pull off of that same particle in the next slide. So I'll show you that. And you can just see how much effect really the anti-agglomerant had on that. So what you could see there wasn't even an adhesion force at all. It was a complete reduction to what could be measured on this apparatus. So that was really promising. So basically with those anti-agglomerants, there was a variety of weight percentages tested. And the findings from that was basically trying to find a minimum weight percent where an adhesion force could actually be measured. And that was all the way down at 0.03 weight percent anti-agglomerant in the system, which produced an adhesion force of 0.13 millinewtons per meter, which is quite comparable to what was seen for the baseline and the time variant, which is relatively low compared to the wall growth with no AA present. And basically the summary from that is that quite confidently a complete reduction in that adhesion force below 0.1 weight percent anti-agglomerant. And then the last part of this research was just to potentially take it down a different route from the anti-agglomerants and see in Olga to extract some of the shear stresses from a simulation and see how those shear stresses might be able to contribute to overcoming the adhesion force of some of those wall-grown particles. So a nominal case was used in Olga of a 50-kilometer flow line with a 2-inch pipe diameter and a 100-bar pressure differential. And that was basically just a water dominant system. And so what was taken from Olga was the shear wall flowing shear stresses. And then basically that was used to calculate the lift force that might be experienced by a hydrate particle that adhered to the wall. And that was basically balanced against the adhesion force that was measured, and it was used as the 8 millinewton per meter value to be conservative, the highest value recorded. So this basically shows that the shear stress required is dependent on that hydrate particle diameter. And basically the findings for this nominal case was that hydrate particles with a diameter greater than 55 micron were able to actually be removed with the wall flowing shear stresses in that case without any AAs present. And it should also be noted that there were no consideration of moments or sort of the rolling of those particles along the wall, which would also contribute to that removal. So just to recap on those conclusions based on everything we've seen in the presentation, was that there was that significant lower affinity of the TPC for hydrates than carbon steel, which was really promising, which was shown as an 80% reduction. The hydrates were shown not to sinter to the TPC with that longer contact time. And I forgot to mention, but that's, I guess the takeout from that is that's really encouraging for transient operations when we can have shutdowns in flow and we can see that flow potentially sitting in the pipeline for a longer period of time. That sort of gives you a bit of confidence that they won't cause that problem to a higher degree than what might be seen in a different pipeline material. And lastly, to recap, the wall growth particles, obviously with that 100-fold increase in adhesion force, were shown as being the most problematic and highest risk, and those could be mitigated quite well with the presence of a low weight % of anti-agglomerants. And some of the points for the way forward from this, so I think it would be quite advantageous to test this material potentially at some point in a single pass flow loop under more sort of continuous and realistic conditions to see how it holds up with hydrates. I think that surface roughness might be good to investigate with its effect on adhesion force. So particularly with those wall growth particles, that was quite interesting with how the shape of the surface of that material interacted with the particle and how that surface roughness might affect if there was a more rough material. Another thing was investigation between subcooling and adhesion force. So historically with a lot of these materials we've seen, and also with hydrate particle cohesion, that a decrease in subcooling results in an increase in adhesion force because that liquid layer around the particle melts a bit more and contributes to that adhesion. And basically, I just think this will contribute to the sort of understanding and profile of that material more if it was potentially to progress to industry. And I think a confirmation of this potentially using the high pressure MMF, which is basically similar to my apparatus, operated under more realistic conditions with a more realistic composition closer to what you might find in a natural gas pipeline, also at high pressures, which you'll hear about, I think, a little bit from Colorado School of Mines people after this. Thank you very much for listening.